Criminals embrace new technology at lightning speed, driving the cutting edge. Governments adopt new technology at a snail's pace. Every single time a breakthrough arrives, this painful gap proves true. It's proven true for me through 30 years in government service. Not because they're smarter than us, not because they have more intention, not because they believe more in their mission than we do. Their success is quite simple. Nobody made them fill out a form first. No procurement cycle, no legal review, no pilot program, no budget line that dies in committee. A criminal organization finds a tool that makes money, and it's in use faster than we can spell the word procurement. We find the same tool. 3 years later, we're still drafting policy for it. Criminal money lives and thrives there, in that gap between criminal efficiency and institutional deliberation. My guest today spent 30 years watching that gap from the inside. Then he got tired of watching, walked out, and built the damn tool himself. This is Cease and Desist. I'm Jason Sandoval. If you're new here, this show isn't about managing clean money. It's about chasing and nabbing dirty money. We talk about how money hides and moves, how we take it, and the far more awkward question of what taking it actually accomplishes. My guest today has done the thing most of us only dream about. Jonathan Benton spent more than 30 years in British law enforcement, detective superintendent, head of the UK's International Corruption Unit at the National Crime Agency. He built Britain's national response to international corruption, the Abori case, the OPL 245 oil block investigation, the investigation into Nigeria's former petroleum minister. He designed the International Anti-Corruption Coordination Center, which exists because grand corruption doesn't respect a border, and neither should our response to it. He advised the Prime Minister's Global Anti-Corruption Summit. He advised the World Bank. He was a director at the Century, following the money out of conflict zones. And then he left all that behind and founded Intelligent Sanctuary, where he's building the technology he spent 3 decades wishing he had. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Jason, thank you. Always, Jason, at this point, feel incredibly sort of humble because, yes, whilst I was privileged to do all that amazing, interesting work and work with some fantastic people and work with some really, really great colleagues from across the pond from your side who are now dear friends, which demonstrates that, to your point about the criminals being one step ahead, and it is a global effort and it has to be. You've got to work together. But I think moving now into the kind of technology space, there are some opportunities, particularly around fraud. It's pernicious. It's disgusting. It targets the most vulnerable in our society. It's the highest volume crime here in the United Kingdom. It's growing exponentially. I think, and I might be slightly wrong here, but I think if you are a victim of fraud in the UK, you have about a 1% chance of your case being investigated and significantly less than that chance of anybody being prosecuted. So the chance of ever getting anything back, getting your money back it's sad. It's sad statistics. Law enforcement are fighting desperately trying to deal with the high profile cases and can't deal with the volume. So we've got to think outside the box. And that's kind of where we are, and others are now really sort of getting clever people around the table and going, what are the solutions here? What can we do?
Jonathan, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I want to kind of give some background on my experience just so you understand where I'm coming from and the listeners understand where I'm coming from. I spent decades chasing criminal conduct and its proceeds around the world as both an intelligence officer and then as a DEA special agent. I served in places like Sinaloa, Kabul, did tours in Islamabad, Quetta, Dubai, Istanbul, Rome, many places in between all of those. And they were all kind of different corners of the same business. I'll admit on the record, and you and I have both already alluded to in this conversation, on technology for most of that career. I ate criminal dust. The government ate that same dust. All the good guys ate the dust, always. We weren't steps behind. I believe we were miles behind. Early in my career, I served in an agency that spent upwards of 60 to 90 million dollars in the mid 90s building an internal clunky leak analysis tool that seldom worked. They scrapped it about 4 years in after throwing so much money at it when they realized that they could purchase Analyst Notebook from I2 for about $3,000 per license and perform the kind of intuitive link analysis that came to define the industry in the coming years. I watch years later as governments struggle to understand blockchain and cryptocurrency and their broader implications in confronting transnational organized crime. The first time I personally came across crypto as an investigator or more as a supervisor, the group I was leading took almost 3 weeks to understand what we were looking at and another 2 weeks to actually seize it. So when we talk about tooling today, I'm hearing that not as a policy argument. I'm hearing that as an insider who fumbled, bumbled, and tripped quite often when we encountered those new technologies. You left service to go build a tool that I'm assuming you were inspired to build because you saw that gap. I left and joined a tool, the asset reality that is, that was inspired by the same mission. I wonder if our shared motivation to work the mission by throwing off the bureaucratic yoke will prove more rewarding than our public service careers. You led some of the UK's most complex corruption investigations, and then you left to build the company that you now lead. What did 30 years on the inside teach you about where the system was structurally failing?
So I think if I was to put it in one word, I'd say agility, just not agile enough. So again, Jason, we could chat all afternoon and give out stories of vast sums of money spent on projects which essentially didn't deliver. And I think one of the key things now, and back to your critical point you raised right at the beginning, and when you were talking about all the amazing work you've done around the world, working in posts, the criminals are always ahead because they don't have the bureaucracy. They're agile because they can bring together the right skills. They can bring techie people, they can bring fraudsters, they can bring people who can organize it, people who can fund it and suddenly make the operation work. We are less so. And I have stories exactly like you where, not to digress too much, but I was running a huge covert undercover operation. I was on the money side of it, the money laundering side of it, purchasing guns and drugs from Europe. And I never forget having an argument, a heated discussion with a finance person when at the end of the operation, we said, we need you to have a wallet to send back the Bitcoin that remains from purchasing guns and drugs over the length of this operation. Right. Okay. And what does a wallet mean? And to explain it all and all the rest of it, get it all set up. That takes a load of paperwork and pain and meetings. And then eventually they couldn't understand why the value of what we were transferring back was more than the value of what we'd taken out initially, yet we'd been buying guns and drugs. And when I explained that how much Bitcoin had gone up and that it just gone up in value, and yes, we had spent Bitcoin, but this is how crypto works, they couldn't get it. And they couldn't reconcile the figures. But back to my point about agility, law enforcement, and I personally think investigators, whether they're inside law enforcement, whether they're outside working for non-government organizations, in private companies, etc., they need to think differently. And we need smart people who've grown up in a different generation to me, Jason. I don't know about yourself, but, I didn't grow up pulling computers apart and coding and all the rest of it. Yet now I've got people, and in fact, one of my amazing detectives that's recently left and come from the Met and leads our crypto side, he sits and codes because he's thinking how the criminals are thinking and thinking what they're doing and going, right, how can we find a solution? How can we leverage Claude to write the code to be able to deal with this so that we can interact with them. We can try and identify even an IP address so we can get to a location if they haven't obfuscated it. All of that requires a different type of investigator. And it does require people who can use technology, can still investigate, but can still do this in a very different environment to, frankly, me putting a surveillance team behind a bunch of drug couriers and watching them do a handover and then taking them out and all the rest of it, which is a very different type of investigation, as we all know.
Was it that recognition, that revelation or epiphany, call it what you will, that not only did we need a different kind of tool, but we needed a different kind of investigator who could understand that tool and the data coming from it, that ultimately inspired your product roadmap for Intelligent Sanctuary?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And part of what we did, I think back to this point I made earlier about, I call it the epidemic levels of fraud. Just the sheer volume of it is so huge because the opportunity for the criminals is so great, and the likelihood of getting any form of action taken against you is sadly statistically so low. Add that into the fact that you can be operating out of a factory in Myanmar and you're using AI to adapt your voice, and you're then using things like AI when we're doing the stuff on chain to be able to create the wallets. It becomes a very complicated matter for somebody to investigate. And now, one of the things that we certainly found, and I'm sure you're familiar with it with some of the cases like Tulip and Jones and others that have been prominent cases here in the UK over the last few years in the crypto space, we started to think about how do we use that technology to sort of fight back a bit, just to try and close down the gaps. And that was fundamentally one of the first steps that we took into this space, much like Asset Reality, about the side that you do on the seizure and the ability to look after the assets, is about how do we do something that just takes us a little step forward. And that's where we started looking very closely at particularly what happened in Jones, but then in parallel doing something similar, but going, we can push the boundaries of the technology more here to help victims, to help lawyers, and to help exchanges.
Let's talk about that engagement, the public-private partnership engagement a little bit, particularly because, as you know, in the investigative space, when you're on the inside, you ultimately rely on process overseen by a compliance function, right? Defines our world when you're in-service investigator. And you may have an end game in investigation-wise, and as long as it follows what the bureaucratic playbook tells you to follow. And there's a lot of people who believe that without that process, we leave space for corruption and malfeasance on the malign end of the spectrum. And then on the benign end of the spectrum, you risk inquiries by oversight entities who could bring accusations of misuse of public funds. That's the logic and the justification behind bureaucratic process, of course. In that respect, though, something that I found, process becomes almost divine law. The manuals prescribing policy become like sacred scrolls. And to step out of that process serves as sort of like a heresy almost, especially in a big bureaucracy. I saw it more times than not in the multilateral investigative space. Investigators see a process that's broken and try to figure workarounds in that space just to get the job done. It's not to be in any way in violation of the law, rules, or anything, but people just wanted to get their jobs done. And I saw cases in which the opposite happened. We had data on a criminal network that was hitting multiple nations. It was multilateral, of course, right? Just like all the good criminals are. We would use unique US laws to go to these partner nations and say, hey, look, we've got this data that shows this person is likely involved in narco-terrorism, because that was the big impact stuff when I was working in the Middle East. And the partners oftentimes, and I'm not going to pick on any country because every country has its issues to deal with. The partners quite often could not wrap their heads around these statutes that we were using and reconcile them in their own judicial system. And so rather than finding a workaround, they just shut it down. They reasoned it cost prohibitive to break process, to break the divine scrolls on a rock, so to speak, no matter how appalling the criminal's conduct might be in their territory. So I think you and I agree in something, and we've touched on it more than once already today. Institutions don't fail because the people in them are lazy, truthfully. They fail because the process that once worked becomes sacred and immutable, and yet completely inefficient and ineffective. So is that kind of what you were up against as you were conducting investigations and you were working these huge cases, and then you ultimately realized there's a better solution for this that I can't action while I am beholden to the bureaucracy?
Yeah, definitely inside. I call this inside, and I sometimes also my former life, when I was in public service, and both now in what I also call the real world. which is, the reality of what's going on the rest of the world, and which sometimes when you're on the inside, you're not very good at looking outside and understanding kind of what's going on. And I want to come back and sort of back to this sort of digital asset space. I think, to your point, that there's definitely opportunity here now. There is huge opportunity when we think about embracing technology. So to give you an example, and I think it's where kind of public-private partnerships, where perhaps former colleagues of mine, not just US, UK, but all over the world, could start to think about how they embrace this. So one of the ways that in the Jones case, which many listeners may be familiar with, was ostensibly partly first about the service of a court order and service of all the court papers by non-fungible token on chain. However, what we can now do, and certainly something we've been working on and worked really, really hard on over the last few years, is to go, how do we do this like en masse, on scale, really, really fast, so that every fraud victim, as soon as they report the fraud, we can mark the wallet with an immutable token. Now, this is an important point because the first tokens used were not immutable. This might get a bit sort of deep in the tech. It's a little bit like, and I don't know if you have this, Jason, in the US. In the UK, when we still used cash, and I know we rarely do use cash now, but when we did, it used to be delivered by a security guard out of a van. They'd take it out of a hatch. It'd be attached to their wrist by chain. They'd take it into the bank, or they'd take it into wherever they're going, or to the cash machine and deposit it, undo the chain. If you're a robber, you come along, you stick a gun to that security guard's head, you rip it out of their hand, you run off with the case. As you know, a really simple invention, just dye all the notes a colour so that they can't be used. A compressed dye goes off inside, it makes all the notes colour. We're trying to do the same with the blockchain. That's the mission. The mission is to openly, not through closed data sources like blockchain analytics tools or anything like that, openly, so it can be seen on every single blockchain explorer, to mark all these wallets immutably with effectively a die to say this contains stolen money. And importantly, making sure it can't be removed. The only people that can remove it are us. It has to be, this is a phrase I came up with. Nobody in the crypto world you'll ever hear talk like this. I call it a semi-soulbound token. We changed the protocol on ERC 271, the protocol for essentially an NFT and then a soulbound token. And we made it so that we could stick it on and move it. Only we could do our tech could move it off. The reason this is important, the reason this is kind of like, I think back to the point of what you were saying, the challenges in law. We know we can't deal with the volume of fraud. I say we as in law enforcement. You in the US authorities, the UK, the European, wherever you are, we just cannot deal with volume. So the smart way is we've got to design it out. We have to think of ways of designing out the crime now and just making it easier for the exchanges, because now they're looking back 5 hops, particularly for sanctions, to just go, there is a very clear marker on this wallet. It's got a police reference number on it. It shows that it's the proceeds of crime. I'll freeze it. And who knows if it ends up in a wallet that's also linked to what then turns out to be another 100, 200 interesting suspicious transactions. It's a money mule account. They can report. Who knows? It may then instigate, and they can report through the SAR or STR process. It may instigate a police investigation, and it may just get some justice for that victim.
So talking about actually using your technology in the investigative and then ultimately the judicial process, your technology has been used before the High Court in Singapore and in the UK to identify end users behind criminal crypto wallets. What does your tool do that standard blockchain analytic tools don't? Like in a nutshell, not in a nutshell. Give me the big picture of what it does.
So the thing is, when we sat right at the beginning, Jason, we have to go back a bit. It was back in 2022, 23. We were dealing with a US Web3 company, lost 3 million in an investment scam. Really simple fraud, really. They did like they do in so many of these cases. They socially engineered the clients, the people involved, very clever people, investment bankers, thought that they were getting a huge inward investment. In order to demonstrate they had liquidity, they had to go to a meeting and put, as you know, a wallet really is only the holder of the private key, a cold wallet. They had to show that they had control of those funds and transferred them. Without complicating matters, this was done in a room where they were able to access it and swap the key and then quickly draw down the funds. So we were trailing it, and for legal reasons, we decided Singapore was the right place to commence legal action. Now, we had, as so often is the case with investigators, we're looking at half of it still remains on chain, half of it's been off-ramped and gone to exchanges. Again, like many, the whole process of informally writing to the exchanges, trying to put them on notice. As we all know, there's a whole bunch of them that are reactive and supportive, and there's some that are less so. So we had a dilemma. First of all, the fraudsters, the only route we had to communicating with them was via the wallets we knew they controlled. Secondly, we had a bunch of money on chain that we were watching and could set up night and day watching. We could set alerts. You can use the blockchain analytics tools, some of them emails. And what we advised the lawyers said, look, the criminals know we're onto them, yeah, because they've off-ramped some of it and the exchanges have frozen it. They've told us they've frozen it. So as far as the criminals go, they haven't been able to realize that money through the money mules. What do you want to do about the money on chain? First of all, we conserve via NFT. That wasn't entirely novel. Jones, we've talked about that, but I said we conserve by NFT, but we can change the tech. I'm confident in that. Secondly, I think we can do more with it. And what I did was I built in the ability so that when the notice goes on chain, we start to collect IP data. Now, the very first time we did this, and you'll appreciate this, Jason, from a law enforcement investigator perspective, one thing we're constantly trying to do with a crypto investigation is attribution. It's the key thing. Who on earth is behind this wallet? If we can get attribution, we might be able to identify them. If we can identify them, we might be able to identify other assets that our clients can make a claim against to get some restitution. A whole load of things unravel from that. But, of course, criminals use VPNs, etc. And the very first time we deployed this, our semi-soulbound token, it was a Tor browser from the Netherlands. Within 29 minutes, an open IP address looked at it and viewed the NFT. It took us to an address in Paris, which several months later the police raided, and evidence of the fraud was still there.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think it kind of leads into sort of a discussion point that I have, and then maybe give you an opportunity to expand on that a little bit more. I go back to Sinaloa, chasing Chapo, pre-blockchain. I want to tell you a version of this problem of attribution that haunts law enforcement all the time, especially when obfuscation is, especially with respect to assets and funds that criminals constantly complicate our lives with as law enforcement. I'm speaking somewhere in the period, I won't tell you exactly, but I'll just call it 5 years before Satoshi's white paper. In Mexico, I had access to a full public property registry. Every parcel, every transfer, every data, every date, every person listed in that public registry, whoever transacted property across 2 states of Mexico that were important to the Sinaloa cartel. Total transparency to a degree, right? And what I discovered was a portfolio worth tens, if not hundreds of millions that belonged to, on paper, cousins, aunts, nephews, minor children, family members of Chapo Guzman. His name, though, appeared nowhere on any of it. In order to build something proving that this was part of his illicit empire, I would have needed some kind of independent attribution to show, yes, this is really money. This was really Chapo Guzman's drug money flowing in to purchase these properties. So to a degree, that ledger was both perfect at once and useless at once, independent of some kind of other attribution. So is it that IP data and the other geographic data that is available on chain at times when they're not using VPNs or they're not using Tor or whatever that makes it more solvable than the more analog type of data registries and databases like a public register for property?
Before we answer that question, now in its third year, Seize London has become the meeting point for the people shaping how governments seize, manage, and dispose of criminal assets. On the 24th of September 2026, we'll bring together the decision makers driving the future of seized asset management for a day of frank, in-person discussion and networking that goes beyond the surface. Seize London is a free, in-person event. Head to the Asset Reality website to register your interest now. We look forward to welcoming you. And back to the episode.
I would say I'm a great believer in the opportunity that blockchain offers us as investigators. It's much easier for me to trace digital assets than it is to trace cash exchanging. You'd have dealt with Jason like I did with Hawala banking and so on, which is hugely complex to get there and say, right, this money that's ended up in this part of the world belongs to organised criminal or corrupt politician, whatever. But I think there's a couple of things happened here. A lot of credit should go to the blockchain companies and to the exchanges because the data that they're gathering as well, when you combine it. So, okay, yes, we were putting something on chain. We're gathering location data. We're doing a number of other interesting things with it as well, some of which I can't necessarily talk about right now, which have been developed for law enforcement only. But what you do then get is, in that particular case was interesting. We very, very quickly got disclosure from some of the exchanges, which gave us even things like not just IP data, geolocation data that we were able to match with what we had around usage, but then things like where they were using a certain exchange's Visa card. And in one particular instance, using very soon after the fraud, that exchange Visa card in a cash point machine that had a camera. So there is a number of opportunities here that start to join up. And I agree with you that whole thing about, I dealt with it in corruption cases for years and years and years. Like really, and I always said, not to digress too much, but fighting corruption was in the financial crime space was one of the hardest things I ever did because you're facing what are often very intelligent people with very deep pockets, with very well-resourced people around them. So smart lawyers, smart accountants, smart bankers. You're up against the AAA team. And they will make sure that assets are obfuscated, that the ownership structure is such that it's really difficult for you to sort of pin it on. But they still make mistakes. And I think the blockchain's the same. We still had it in big cases where properties were put in offshore trusts, etc., but they still had domestic bills. The wife was paying them from her bank account and they were in her name. And you go, well, hang on a minute. Your wife is paying the domestic bill for this property in Johannesburg that she's been paying for the last 3 years. And you're saying it's not yours? And your private jet, we've tracked it to the local airport and all the other circumstantial evidence that you put on top just to go, well, hang on a minute. Really, really sorry, Mr. Bory, but that huge villa in Johannesburg is your villa. Fight me if you want, but we're saying it's your villa. And you've got to accept it. And it's the proceeds of corruption because you can't prove the origin. The blockchain's given us the same opportunities now around attribution, albeit it's hard. And then the use of exchanges which are non-cooperative, which we all know about, one of which has recently been sanctioned by the UK government, make our lives really, really difficult.
You've pointed to Tulip, Deloya, and Jones cases as shaping the legal landscape around digital asset recovery. Take them one at a time. What is each of them actually testing, and how will that ultimately improve asset recovery if it plays out in the direction that those of us in the practitioner space would like to see?
So I think, first of all, Tulip, I think there's two parts to this. There's a legal and there's a policy question. And I appreciate listeners may not just be in the UK, and I apologise because I'll come from a UK legal policy regulation perspective. Let's think about the thrust of the case in Tulip, which really was about, I was defrauded, the victim was defrauded, and the charge against the exchange was the value of the transaction, and the manner in which it was transacted was such that you had a fiduciary duty to identify and stop this. And therefore you are liable for my loss. You've facilitated that because your systems and processes didn't. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was partly of the initial case that the claimant brought against the exchange. Now, one of the things that we've been doing is investigators can mark wallets as suspicious. They can mark them on a whole number of blockchain analytics tools. We don't have an analytics tool. We don't do that. But it's confusing. And anybody can do it. And Jason, I don't know if you're back in law enforcement day, we used to have a system where people could flag nominals and say they're interested in them. And what historically used to happen was people would flag someone, say they've got an interest in them, which means you don't end up with what's called blue on blue in theory. You don't end up with two lots of police investigating in the same person. The system didn't always work. People would forget to take the flags off, etc., etc. The way we flag on the blockchain has made that problem exponentially difficult for exchanges. It's not always really clear why a wallet's been flagged or why it's been marked. Well, let's be also frank here, Jason. There's a lot of really dodgy tracing out there as well. There's some really dodgy tracing. I've seen some rubbish work, which is just shocking, and suddenly making a claim that this is, and not really doing the analysis to a level to be able to get the attribution and assume that you mark something and you put yourself in the shoes of the exchanges. This is really difficult to work out. How far back do we go and how much work have we got to do? So one thing that we wanted to try and do from the outset is if we can mark something within the immutable token, we put it so it's open on the exchange. Next step is put the police reference number on there. So you've got an original source. You can go back, even embed the trace information to date into the token. So that can be read and seen by the exchange rather than just saying this is suspicious. That's a double-edged sword, right? Let's think about it logically. It helps the exchanges because it helps them freeze it. But if the exchanges ignore it, and this was where my thinking was going really around Tulip, in that case, if you've got this really clear note, if you look on Etherscan, you'll see a little node, don't you, next to the address. When we put our token called Rectify, we called it Rectify because everyone knows what rect means in the crypto world, and we're police, so ex-police, some of us, so we don't think too far outside the box and just added IFY onto the end of it, called it Rectify. But did trademark it. We're smart enough to do that. But you put the Rectify token on, then it just becomes, first of all, appears in the node. But secondly, if the exchange can see it, and we can actually send it into the exchange as well, into the wallet that's been transferred to if necessary, if the exchange see it and ignore it, we think we're in a stronger position to help our client go, well, actually, you might have a claim against this exchange. And that brings us back to my policy point that I said, if you look at fraud in the UK, from a policy perspective, we just couldn't fight it. The government had to keep thinking of ways. And I used to advise on the board of one of what is now our largest financial institution in the UK. And we faced massive problems, like every financial institution does with fraud. And what the government and the regulators did was, with things called push payment fraud, was start to say that there has to be an automatic compensation scheme. We all know the idea behind this is not just to keep draining money out of the banks and make them pay victims. It's for the banks to design the systems to prevent the fraud happening in the first place.
Which was the impetus behind your markers that satisfy
Exactly.
20 of the of the FATF recommendations, right?
Exactly, Jason. That was the whole idea. That was the whole kind of push, was say, how do we do something, but also starts to design this out and make it easier. And you're right, the FATF really should be hugely credited. They were talking about blockchain risk in 2011, when, like you say, when nobody really understood it at all. 2011, 2012, they were increasing their reporting. And the recommendation, you've got to be able to flag, you've got to do everything you can to seize, you've got to, So that's the whole drive behind it.
Well, at the risk of Americanizing the conversation a little bit, you look at the blockchain and you look at the proliferation of crypto assets, virtual assets across the blockchain over the last 15, 16 years. It's been the wild, wild west, right? It's just open prairie, people running wild. There's some big dog bellwether assets like Bitcoin and Ether, and then there's some crazy stuff out there that facilitates criminal activity. There's an industry seeking legitimacy. And through that, you're going to have both regulation and you're also going to have jurisprudence in action trying to either bring it into a regulated, governed space from a relatively unregulated, ungoverned space. And you're going to require case law and you're going to require good, sound legislation. And when you talk about use of the blockchain, you talk about crypto tracing tools in court, are we just simply seeing as courts test the validity of blockchain tracing along with the independent attribution related to that blockchain tracing as we put legal pressure and legal we find and the legal systems find the pain points within those two spaces that speak to the same independent evidentiary truth that would be introduced in court? Are we just simply observing just application of rules of evidence on an industry that until now had existed in quasi ungoverned or unregulated space?
I'd answer that in part. In part, I think we are. My familiarity of the law is much more in respect of what's happening, the developments here in the UK. But I do think we're making huge steps forward. You talk about the three principal cases, the recognition of property and just understanding that this stuff, this set of numbers that just sits somewhere in the internet between different nodes on the blockchain is property, and is property in which an action can be taken against. The fact that I think we will move faster and faster to a position where if exchanges don't have the right systems and processes in place, that there will be liability sitting on their shoulders for not preventing the loss of a victim's funds. I meet and talk to MLROs, money laundering reporting officers from exchanges quite frequently. They're fighting a difficult battle. They're playing a lot of catch up. You called it the Wild West, Jason. There's a lot of firms out there. We got 56 here, virtual asset service providers registered in the UK, that have tried to start off on the right footing, but it's complicated. They might have taken books of clients on from other firms, which the due diligence and the know your customer or know your business is not to the level that we would ordinarily expect in this day and age. And they're having to play catch up. And I think finally we are seeing this kind of quasi process at the moment where regulation, the spirit of the regulation has been adopted before the regulation arrives by some, in an attempt. And the law, back to your point about the law as well, I think this is a really interesting point. There are people that understand blockchain analytics tools far better than I do. I'm just an investigator. I've got techie people. I've been following money all my life. I know how criminals behave. I know how they money launder. It's a unique skill set. It has application in a number of different settings. And thankfully, we're all using it in the right one and not advising people how to launder money. But the law, I still think, is learning about the challenges with tracing, learning about the methodology, learning about the best methods. There's reports being presented to courts de facto, which are not correct. There's even some of the leading blockchain analytics companies are putting their hands up and saying, we can't entirely, whilst we may be able to give an inclination as to attribution, we can't be entirely sure. And even sometimes when that information is being tested in a legal environment, as you and I are familiar with, Jason, there's some really smart barristers out there who will pull this apart, rightly so, to really test the evidence. And I still think it feels to me like we're all in kindergarten. We're all in the early, we haven't gone into the middle school yet. We've still got a lot of learning to do in this space.
Across this continuum, we have end users, which are everything from financial institutions that want to offer crypto as a product. You've got individual users like the you and me's of the world. And then you've got miners that are sitting there helping mine crypto. You've got intermediaries in that space, which are the exchanges, right? And I think at one point I've read something that you put out calling the intermediaries the weak point. I spent years investigating drug loads moving around the world via maritime containerized cargo. It's how the sweeping majority of the world's contraband moves. I think something like 80% of the world's cocaine moves via containerized cargo. Shipping lines, in my experience, have been both cooperative and are overwhelmingly innocent, but also inundated with so much cargo, it would be impossible to find cocaine loads. That's all they would spend their time doing in terms of security, looking for cocaine. Their ships carry bananas, but they unwittingly carry the cocaine that criminals have hidden among the bananas. Customs equally has an impossible choice. Inspect everything, kill legitimate commerce, inspect nothing, and suddenly you become complicit by negligence. It seems to me that an exchange is almost in exactly the same position as the shipping lines and customs, only for money. So when we highlight that intermediaries are the weak point, are they the weak point because they're failing at something they could reasonably do? Or are we asking a commercial business to solve a problem that the state hasn't been able to solve on its own?
I'd almost go as far to say we're asking a commercial business to solve a problem that it has no choice it's got to solve. I would say let's just look at banking, right? Look at how much money is spent on compliance, how much money is spent on transaction monitoring. You talk about intermediaries, right? The amount of times I dealt with Deutsche Bank, UBS, people like that who were correspondent banks who were moving not just millions, but hundreds and hundreds of millions in transactions. And they weren't really making very much money on it. They didn't have the client info. They didn't have the client relationship. They didn't have the destination relationship. They had 57 lines on a transaction report, which has different codes in it and maybe a little bit of written explanation as to why these funds were moving. And they have to decide whether they're going to stop that or not. And they've got seconds to do it. But the regulations, the money laundering regulations, didn't say law enforcement solved that problem, didn't say government solved that problem. It said banks, you solve that problem. This is your responsibility to make sure you understand it. And we're going to move into that space in the crypto, whether we like it or not. And the fact now we're seeing exchanges sanctioned, we've seen mixers sanctioned, we've seen the US, you would have seen this, Jason, as the war broke out in Gaza, wallets. I mean, I was with OFAC at the time they sanctioned the first lot of wallets. I was looking at the wallets and there was hardly anything in them. The important thing was that Treasury were taking that bold action to say this particular wallet has been used, we know, for terrorist funding, often put on Telegram channels, that sort of thing. So at least just by flagging that, even if there are 5 hops from that wallet, the technology has to adapt and be able to go, well, hang on a minute. We know that even if it's gone through a peeler chain or something and starting to be broken down, we're satisfied that some of this has come from that sanction wallet, and therefore we've got a duty to freeze it under sanctions. Because OFAC have done the right thing, stuck a notice, a public notice, to say that address is linked to terrorist funding. My point being, I would just say that we've got no choice. And the technology has to keep evolving. Now it's super hard for exchanges given the volume of transactions, the speed at which they happen, the speed at which they're settled. We know obviously some move faster on a blockchain than others. Complicated, but there is no choice but to do something about this. Because if you're an exchange and you breach sanctions, what's going to happen to you?
Excellent rhetorical question. I mean, I feel like we could talk about these subjects for hours, honestly, Jonathan. And I think I'm going to round out with one subject that I wanted to broach with you that ends us on a positive note. You designed the IACC. So I want to ask you to help me resolve something that I don't know if I've ever fully resolved in my head. I ran a multilateral public corruption case at the end of my career that touched 29 countries. It may or may not have involved a person with the last name of Assad. Although a few partners were less than cooperative during the investigation, most partners shared everything openly and honestly. And truthfully, as we were investigating that case, I put faith in people's goodwill, not necessarily in any type of system that seldom would have worked anyway if we had tried to put pressure through MLATs or anything of that nature. And I believe it worked because people chose to behave well. They believed in the mission we were doing, not because anything forced them to act in the way that they were. You built a structure that I believe is meant to encourage cooperation or at least force it. Do you think that architecture makes it easier for people to exhibit goodwill?
So, look, I didn't. The actual building of it was done by other people. I can't take any credit for that whatsoever. What happened was we had a big summit, Prime Minister Cameron, after the last G8, the very last G8 before Russia was no longer part of the G8 at Lochern, came up with a plan to have a big anti-corruption summit. Proposals were put forward. And I put a proposal forward and said, look, these international corruption cases, the biggest problem is often coordination. It's not crime where it's committed, because often crime is committed in 20 plus different countries. Any one of us could lead it, but we need an ability to exchange information and work and cooperate and take a collective action approach. And Jason, that goes exactly to your asset case. And it really goes to the problem. If we think about it in the digital asset space, this goes to the challenge that exchanges have got, virtual asset service providers right now. Banks have grappled with this. They've come up with public-private partnership information sharing agreements. They've grappled with banking secrecy. They've grappled with how they even share information within their own bank. You know, not to name any banks, but a load of my mates who did similar jobs to me have gone off to become senior people in compliance in the biggest banks in the world. And they've had challenges inside. But I think for digital assets, one thing we could grab really quickly and work out is how on earth we exchange information really quickly on bad actors, bad wallets, bad transactions. How do we collaborate in such a way? You look at some of the teams, Jason, I don't know if it's right to say this, but you look at Coinbase and KuCoin, some of them, and their investigations teams. They are awesome. They're people I used to work with. They're very, very capable. And they are more than capable of sharing really useful information and setting up that process now and I know it's been done in different forms, but it's got to be key. There's a bit of a strength in numbers here. And the strength in numbers is just going to start to design out and make it harder and harder for the criminals to operate. It'll push them to the HTXs. Of course it will. And that's why, HTX is now sanctioned. We see it increasingly. It will push them to them. But it also means my criminal that wants to be able to have a Visa card linked to their crypto account, that wants to be able to easily transact, that wants to be able to use it in a much more agile way and live off the benefits of crime. Their life's been made a little bit harder because they're not going to have access to the good, properly functioning, law-abiding exchanges.
Well, Jonathan, I've got to say, opening my closing remarks, our closing remarks, thank you for the last enlightening hour. Intelligent sanctuary like Asset Reality seek to introduce efficiencies that didn't exist before them, efficiencies that are now available to investigators in a marketplace that isn't saturated with these kinds of solutions as one might imagine it would be. And it's heartening to see these solutions like these come into the market so that investigators' lives are made easier and they can focus on the actual investigation versus the technology or the technical aspects underpinning the technology. Give us your closing thoughts and tell our listeners where they can find your work.
So we're about bringing clarity and confidence in the information that's available on the blockchain. I run a private company, but I've never, ever, ever, you never lose that public spirit and that why you joined up that uniform on all those years ago. I see victims of fraud every single day and we want to help and we are going to, and we're going to keep designing until we help them get their money back. And I think come and have a look at us, www.iSanctuary, it's iSanctuary.io. Come and see what we're doing. We're talking at the Cambridge International Economic Crime Symposium in a couple of weeks. Aidan, founder of Asset Reality, a dear friend and colleague and someone I've worked with for many years, is going to be there speaking with us. We've got 2 days talking about really interesting stuff on digital assets. We've got exchanges, policy people, regulators, lawyers, barristers, investigators. You couldn't get a more rich mix of people who care about this and have an interest in it to have a proper debate about what's happening now and what needs to happen in the future.
Thank you, Jonathan. To our friends, collaborators, and first-time listeners, next time somebody shows you a blockchain screenshot with the red line running across it, ask the first question that matters. Whose hand is on it? And then ask the harder one. Could you prove that to a judge and jury? If the problems talked about today are problems you're wrestling with, seizing, managing, recovering criminal assets, that's exactly what Asset Reality was built for. Reach out at assetreality.com. Join the movement. Change the paradigm underpinning asset recovery. Follow the show. We at Asset Reality, where asset recovery is our only mission, look forward to your next listen and thank Jonathan for his time today. I'm Jason Sandoval. This has been Seize and Desist. We'll seize you next time.
Seize and Desist is produced by Lo Ferner and edited by Tobias Ferner. Our podcasts are for informational purposes only. They are not intended to provide legal, tax, financial, and/or investment advice. Listeners must consult their own advisors before making any decisions on the topics being discussed.